Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive, and boy do we have a thinker for you today. We're going medieval, folks, to tackle a topic that might sound simple on the surface, but trust me, it gets deep, fast. We're talking about singular terms.
Singular terms, yeah. You know, those words we use every day to pick out specific things like Socrates or this table right here, or even that fluffy cat napping over there.
So pretty basic stuff, right? I mean, we learn these kinds of words as kids. What makes them so special for medieval philosophers?
Well, because they stumbled onto some really interesting questions. Like if I say Socrates, am I just listing off a bunch of attributes? Like a snub nose, a certain way of walking, maybe a fondness for hemlock? Or am I actually getting at something deeper about who Socrates is, like his essence?
Ah, I see. So it's not just about labeling, but about whether language can really capture the essence of a unique individual. This wasn't just something they cooked up over a pint of mead, was it?
No, not at all. They were building on a tradition that went all the way back to ancient grammar. Thinkers like Priscian, he had this influential textbook that categorized words, but these medieval philosophers, they wanted to go further. They were grappling with how singular terms functioned logically, not just grammatically.
It's like they were taking grammar class and turning it into a full-blown philosophical puzzle.
Exactly. And, they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Take Peter Abelard, for example. He was this prominent 12th century logician, a real firebrand, and he absolutely rejected the idea that Socrates was just a shorthand for a bunch of random qualities.
I can see why he'd push back on that. It seems to reduce Socrates to a mere collection of traits, right?
Mhm.
Kind of misses the whole point of him being Socrates.
You got it. And to make things even more complicated, they had Aristotle's idea lurking in the background. The idea that individuals don't have a fixed, unchanging essence. If we're always in flux, always evolving, how can a singular term really pin us down?
It makes those terms seem almost paradoxical. We use them to point to specific individuals, but those individuals are always changing, always becoming.
That's the crux of it. And it led to some interesting distinctions. They started separating ordinary proper names, the ones we use day to day, from these more abstract, ideal, logically proper names, whatever those are.
So now it's not just, is this a singular term, but what flavor of singular term is it? It sounds like we're about to enter a whole taxonomy of names.
Hold on to your hats, because it gets even wilder. What happens when you start talking about names for things that no longer exist? Like, what about Caesar? Does that name still mean anything, even though Caesar himself is long gone?
Oh man, that's a head scratcher. If the meaning of a name depends on the person or thing it refers to actually being around, does that mean all talk of history is just empty noise?
That was a big philosophical dilemma. Some thinkers, like Boethius of Dacia, argued that the mind plays a crucial role here. Just like you can think about your grandmother even though she's not physically present, the concept, the idea, remains.
So the name doesn't become meaningless just because the physical thing is gone?
Yeah.
It's like this mental footprint that lingers.
You're catching on. And this line of thinking, it starts to nudge us toward this really radical idea called nominalism. The notion that big universal concepts like humanity or justice might just be names we use, mental constructs without any independent existence outside of our minds.
Whoa, hold on. So we've gone from basic grammar to profound questions about meaning, existence, even the nature of reality itself. These medieval folks weren't messing around.
Hey, we're not. And speaking of not messing around, that brings us to John Burdon, this 14th century logician who really took this whole singular term business to the next level.
Burden. Now that name rings a bell. Wasn't he the guy with the donkey? The one that starved to death because it couldn't decide between two bales of hay?
That's the one. Though the story's probably made up, it kind of captures his whole deal. Logic, decision-making, and, yeah, singular terms. But before we get to Buridan's donkey, or his theories, let's take a quick break and come back for part 2, ready to dive even deeper.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were starting to see how complicated things can get with these singular terms. It's not just about how we name things. It actually touches on their whole understanding of logic, metaphysics, you name it, even theology.
Right, you mentioned those areas before, but I'm still a bit fuzzy on the connections. How did a debate about words end up influencing those bigger philosophical questions?
Well, you got to remember the whole system of logic they were using, the one they got from Aristotle, was mostly about universal terms. Statements like all men are mortal or some horses are fast. Singular terms, they weren't really part of the original plan.
Okay. So they had this system for universal statements, and then these singular terms came along like, hey, what about us? And they had to figure out how to make it all work. Exactly. Logicians like Lambert of Auxerre, they had to become like philosophical gymnasts, trying to fit singular terms into this existing logical structure. So they'd come up with propositions like, every man is an animal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is an animal.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. What's the problem?
The catch is that those old school syllogisms, they needed at least one universal premise to work. But with the singular term like Socrates, you're not talking about a whole category, just one dude. So they had to find some workarounds.
So they had to find a way to make a singular statement sound like a universal one.
You got it. Lambert, for example, he suggested you could rephrase Socrates is a man as everything that is Socrates is a man. Sneaky, right?
Yeah, like a bit of philosophical code switching, translating singular into universal. Clever.
But not everyone was on board with these changes. Robert Kilwardby, another big logician, he was like, nope, singular terms, they need their own category. He called them expository syllogisms, kind of like a special case.
So even within this group of thinkers, they had their disagreements about how to deal with these singular terms.
Oh, totally. It wasn't like some monolithic movement. There were debates about how to fit singular terms into logic, metaphysics, and get this, even theology.
Okay, the theology part, I gotta hear more about that.
Yeah.
How did talking about words spill over into their ideas about God?
Well, remember how we were talking about the difficulty of naming individuals who are always changing? That problem, it becomes even bigger when you're talking about God, because God is supposed to be totally unique, unchanging, the whole shebang.
Right, if singular terms work by picking out some essential quality, and God's supposed to be beyond all that, how do you even begin to name him?
That's the dilemma. Some thinkers, like Jeffrey Aspel, they argued that in the strictest sense, individuals don't actually have proper names. He made this distinction between names that signify a form, an essential quality, and names that are just appellative, which is basically just pointing and labeling without really getting at any essence.
Okay, so it's like saying dog signifies that essential dogness all dogs share, but a name like Fido is just a label we stick on a particular dog without saying anything deep about Fido.
That's it. Aspel thought even proper names for people were more like those appellative names, just picking out a thing, not capturing its essence.
That makes you think, like maybe when we name things, we're just pointing and labeling, not really grasping their true depth. And if that's true for regular folks, how much more so for God?
Right, and that led to all sorts of back and forth about whether God could even be considered a proper name. Some argued it was more like a common term because it referred to a concept, the idea of God, not a specific being.
I see. That distinction changes things quite a bit. And then you throw in the Trinity, one God, three persons. That must have really thrown a wrench in things.
It was a total philosophical and theological puzzle. They had to figure out how the same word, God, could apply to both a single essence and three distinct persons. Talk about a brain twister. It really pushed their understanding of identity, how we describe things, the relationship between language and, well, ultimate reality.
It's amazing how they could even wrap their heads around all that.
It shows how seriously they took these questions. And it wasn't just abstract thinking. These ideas about singular terms had real consequences for how they saw the world, what they thought about knowledge, even the relationship between humans and the divine.
So we've seen how this impacted their logic and theology, but what about metaphysics? How did singular terms shape their understanding of being and existence?
One of the big areas where this played out was in discussions about individuation. That is, what makes something a distinct individual, separate from everything else. If individuals don't have a fixed essence, like Aristotle said, then what makes them them?
It's like asking what makes Socrates Socrates? Not just a list of qualities, but the thing that makes him unique.
Exactly. This led to different theories about how individuation works. Some thinkers, following Aquinas, they emphasized the role of matter. They said each individual has its own unique material makeup, which is what sets it apart.
So even if two apples look almost identical, they're still different individuals because they're made of different stuff.
That's the idea. But others, like Duns Scotus, weren't satisfied with just matter. They came up with this idea of haecceity, a unique, indescribable thisness that belongs to each individual thing.
Haecceity. That's a word that could sink a battleship. So it's like saying, beyond all the qualities and stuff we can describe, there's this special something that makes each thing this thing and no other.
You got it. It's a tough one to grasp, but it shows how far they were willing to go to explain individuality, even without fixed essences. And this whole debate about individuation, it was tied up with their understanding of singular terms.
I see. So to figure out how a name like Socrates picks out a specific person, we need to understand what makes Socrates Socrates in the first place.
Exactly. And these discussions weren't just theoretical, they had implications for how they thought about everything from the soul to personal identity over time.
Wow, so from simple questions about names, we've ended up with these huge philosophical questions about identity, time, the whole nature of being. It's like those singular terms were a key that unlocked all these different philosophical doors.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, we still have John Buridan and his grand theory of singular terms waiting for us. He took all these earlier debates and tried to put them together into a coherent system.
You're right. I'm really curious to hear more about Bearden. He seems like a pivotal figure in this whole story.
Oh, he was a big deal. His work on logic and language had a huge influence on later philosophers. So let's dive into Buridan's world in part 3 and see how he tackled these questions about singular terms.
Sounds good to me. Bring on the Bearden.
hmm
Okay, we're back, and I'm ready for the grand finale. Let's hear about this John Bearden and his take on singular terms.
All right, let's talk Buridan. He's really a key figure in all of this. He took everything we've been discussing, the nature of individuals, the problems with naming, the whole connection between language and logic, and tried to create a big, comprehensive system out of it.
So he was like the architect of singular terms,
Yeah.
trying to build a solid structure out of all these different ideas.
That's a good way to think about it. And one of the big things he emphasized was this thing called, and get ready for it, in prospectu cognition. Remember, that's the idea that our knowledge comes from what we experience directly through our senses or remember from our past.
Right, right. Like we were saying before, if I want to understand what Socrates means, I need more than just a definition. I need some kind of contact with him, even if it's indirect, to get the real meaning of that name.
Exactly. Buridan thought this in prospectu cognition was super important for how singular terms work. We can't just define Socrates in some abstract way. We have to have some sort of interaction with him, whether it's firsthand or through stories and shared knowledge.
It's like a name is more than just a label. It's a link to a whole web of experiences, memories, the whole 9 yards.
You're getting it. And this focus on experience, it led Buridan to another important distinction he made. The difference between simple, singular terms and complex ones.
Uh-oh, more categories. I'm already feeling a bit overwhelmed with all these terms.
I know, but this one's a biggie, I promise. So Buridan said a term like Socrates is a simple one. It points straight to the individual without any extra baggage, a direct line from name to person.
Okay, I think I'm with you. Socrates is like a pure, unmixed, singular term. What of those complex ones then?
Well, Buridan thought a term like this man is a complex one. It's made up of two parts. The this part, which is called a demonstrative pronoun, and the man part, a regular noun.
So it's not just picking out a specific person, it's also putting them in a group, giving them a category.
You got it. And even though this seems like a small difference, it had some pretty big implications for his theory of something called supposition. That's a fancy word for how terms refer to things in different logical situations.
Okay, you've mentioned supposition a few times now. It sounds really abstract.
Let me try to explain. Think about how words can do different things in sentences. Sometimes they have that usual meaning, sometimes they're used metaphorically, and sometimes they have a special logical function. Buridan's theory of supposition was all about figuring out those different ways that terms can stand for things.
So it's like he was trying to lay out the rules of the language game, how words work in different contexts.
Precisely. And he said those simple singular terms, like proper names, they have this special kind of supposition called personal supposition. It means they refer directly and clearly to the individual they're about. No room for confusion.
So when I say Socrates, I always mean that one dude. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Right. But those complex singular terms, like this man, they can have different kinds of supposition depending on the situation. Like, in the sentence, this man is running, the this man part, it has what Buridan called material supposition. It's pointing to a specific individual, but it's also saying, hey, this individual, he's also a member of the man species.
So it's like adding a little extra information. This particular guy, who also happens to be a man, is running.
You got it. Now, I know all this stuff about supposition can sound really technical, but it was a really important way for them to clarify how language works and to solve some tricky logic puzzles.
It shows how much they cared about getting the details right. It wasn't just about the words themselves, but how they fit into the bigger picture of meaning and how we connect words to the world, almost like they were developing a kind of philosophical grammar.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, all of this was part of a much bigger project for Buridan. He was dealing with some really fundamental questions about knowledge, logic, the nature of reality, the whole shebang.
And we can't forget his ideas about identity and time, which seemed to really fascinate him. Earlier, we were talking about how tricky it is to think about a name like Socrates when individuals are always changing. Didn't Buridan have some thoughts on how to deal with that?
He sure did. He took on that tough question we discussed, is Socrates the same today as he was yesterday? Seems simple, but it gets really complicated once you start to think about all the philosophical implications.
Right, because even if there is something unique that makes Socrates Socrates, he's not just frozen in time. He grows, he learns, he experiences things. So does that affect our ability to call him the same individual over time?
You're hitting on the key points. Burden was really good at unraveling those subtle nuances. He actually proposed 3 different types of numerical identity, exploring all these different ways something can stay the same while also going through changes.
So it's not just a yes or no answer. It's much more layered than that.
Yeah.
There's different ways to think about identity that we have to consider.
Absolutely. And these ideas, they had a big impact on medieval philosophy. They sparked all these debates about how stable names are, the nature of things existing over time, and even how God's unchanging nature relates to our own human experience of change.
It's amazing how those seemingly simple questions about names opened up all these huge philosophical avenues. It's like they were pulling on a thread that just kept unraveling the whole fabric of reality.
That's a great analogy, and it really shows the power of careful thought and analysis. These thinkers weren't afraid to ask tough questions and to push the limits of what people knew.
You know, it strikes me that a lot of these debates about singular terms are still relevant today. Maybe we don't use the exact same terminology, but we're still wrestling with those fundamental questions about language, meaning, and how we make sense of the world around us.
I completely agree. A lot of the issues they were struggling with, singular terms, reference, how language and thought connect those. Those are things philosophers are still exploring in the 21st century.
So, in a way, these medieval thinkers were laying the foundation for modern philosophy of language. They were asking questions that we're still trying to figure out today.
That's a great observation. Thinkers like Saul Kripke, he was a really influential philosopher in the 20th century, and his work actually builds upon a lot of these medieval ideas. His theory of rigid designators, which is the idea that a name like Socrates always refers to the same guy no matter what qualities he has, well, that has roots in these medieval discussions about essence and individuation.
It's incredible to see those connections across centuries. It's like they planted seeds of thought that are still growing and evolving today.
It really is. And it reminds us that philosophy is this ongoing journey. We're all building on the work of those who came before us, adding our own voices to this never-ending conversation about reality, knowledge, and what it means to be human.
Well, I think it's safe to say we've thoroughly explored the depths of singular terms in medieval philosophy. Who knew those simple little words could lead to such complex and thought-provoking discussions?
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? And it just shows how much philosophy is all around us, hidden beneath the surface of even the most ordinary things.
Absolutely. I hope you, our listeners, are walking away from this deep dive with a newfound appreciation for the power of language and the incredible legacy of medieval thought. Keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and who knows, maybe you'll make some philosophical discoveries of your own. Thanks for joining us.